Let's create our own hook. For that, just to make it really clear, a hook is a normal JavaScript function, but a function that starts with use. That's just a convention though. More importantly, a function which can share stateful logic. So a function which can, for example, use useReducer or use state inside of it, and which React then recognizes and uses such that when in this custom hook you do something that updates a state, your component that uses your custom hook is re-rendered. So it's a special function React recognizes, you could say. A special function you can use in functional components, which React recognizes, and where if inside of that function you change something that impacts the state, React will re-render the component that uses your custom hook. That is what hooks are about in the end. So let's create a custom hook and it should become clearer. In our shared folder next to components, I'll add a hooks folder. Hooks because we will add more than one hook throughout this course. And here I want to add my form-hook.js file. You could also just name it form, of course, if you prefer that. Now in there, I want to hold all my useReducer logic that I set up in new place. So actually, I don't want to be forced to import useReducer and use callback in here, but instead I want to import that in the form hook. So there I want to import use callback and useReducer from React. Then in here I want to have my own function useForm, and your custom hooks always have to start with lowercase use. That's a convention you should adhere to. And I will export this function. So that's my own hook now. I export it here. Now in new place, I have my form reducer, and I will cut that from new place and instead add it here into the form hook outside of the hook function, just like this. In there, we have a lot of logic that basically works standalone. There are no external inputs that are required from our component. This function only needs information about the state and the action, and all that information is passed through parameters. So this function should work just fine here. In new place component, I then also use useReducer. So let's cut this as well and move that into the custom hook, here inside the hook function. Here I call useReducer, I got my form state, I got dispatch, and here I now got some logic which is specific to a component and should not live like that in the hook in general, because not every component where we will use that hook will have title, description, and address inputs. So we'll have to kind of take this initialization logic here for the inputs, take it out of our useReducer call in useForm, and instead maybe expect it here as an argument to our custom hook. So that there I get my initial inputs parameter and I assign this here to inputs. And I also get my initial form validity and I assign this here so that this is also not hard coded into this useReducer initial state, but can be set from outside when we use the custom hook. So back in new place, there I now want to use that custom hook. So I will import useForm from going to the shared folder, hooks, form hook. And here the idea is that we can now call useForm and then pass in our initial input validity as a first argument and the initial form validity, in my case false, as a second argument. This now initializes my useReducer in my useForm hook correctly, hopefully. We're not done though. This input handler should also be taken out of new place and be added to the form hook. Here I can add input handler with use callback, that's still important, use the dispatch function which I get from the useReducer, and then, well, leave my logic in here as it is. Now our hook should also return something, because we're not interested in the form state inside of the hook, we're interested in that state in the place where we use the hook. The same for the input handler. We need to share this with the component which uses our custom hook. So here I will return an array, By the way, you can also return objects or just text or whatever you want. Hooks don't have to return arrays. But here an array makes sense because I want to return my form state and input handler. So a pointer at this input handler function. I return both from inside my useForm hook. And with that in new place, I can get both. Here, useForm returns an array with exactly 2 elements. So on my own hook, I can also use array destructuring to get the form state and the input change handler. Input handler was the name before, so let's keep that name. Input handler. We can assign any name we want here when using array destructuring. So now I get that information back from my hook, but the logic of that reducer and so on now lives inside of that hook. And that hopefully shows the advantage of custom hooks. Our component now got leaner, and we got that logic, that stateful logic. And it is stateful logic. When we call this patch, we will re-render a component. We got that stateful logic in the hook. And because it's a hook and React knows this concept of hooks, when we update the state inside of our custom hook, the component that uses our custom hook will update as well. So therefore now if we save this, add place should work just fine. Here, if I enter something and I have valid inputs everywhere, my overall form becomes valid. And if I invalidate an input, it becomes invalid. If I submit it, we see all the data is there. So our custom hook works. And now we can use that custom hook also in update place, and hence we're sharing all that form management, input change handling logic. So let's go to update place, and there import useForm from shared hooks form hook. And now, just as before, in here, we can call useForm, initialize our inputs and the form itself. The form itself should be valid initially. For the inputs here, we will have a title input. And for the title input, whoops, we need a colon here. For the title input, the value initially is, let's initialize it below identified place. Initially is identified place.title. Is valid of that input is true, therefore, because that will be a non-empty value. And for description, the value is identified place.description, and this will also be valid initially. So then we get back our form state, and we will also get back our input handler. So with that, we can use both. We can use input handler here on the onInput props of our input components. And we can set the value here to form state.inputs.title.value here in this case. And here on the description, it's form state inputs description.value. And the same for the validity. This is form state inputs description is valid. Title is valid. So is valid at the end is important here. And here it's description is valid. Now please note that value and valid only are used in the input component to initialize the value. We could therefore also name it initial value if you wanted to. Maybe that is a bit clearer, to be honest, so that there is no confusion that you think we're always setting a new value here. No, we're just initializing this. So inside of our custom component now, in the input component, we now should use initial value here, and initial is valid here. So basically the props I'm passing here, I named it just initial valid, so just initial valid here as well. That's really important, just to avoid that this is confusing. So with that, back to update place. We're initializing these values. We bind to input handler. Now we can also bind our button here and check if form state is not valid. So if the form is not valid, and only disable the button if that's the case. Now with that, if we go to my places and click on edit, initially the button is enabled, of course, because initially, well, the values are valid. If I do empty this though, the button becomes disabled. It's the same here. If the description is too short, it's disabled. So this seems to work. Now let's also make sure that submitting this works. So in update place, we also can add our submit handler. And I don't want to share this with useForm because the submission logic is very specific to the component in which we do have the form. So here I'll have my place update submit handler, or however you want to call it. We get the event, and I will call event prevent default to prevent that form submission and the request to be sent. And then console log form state.inputs to see what's stored in there. And then we can bind place update submit handler to on submit here on our form. And if we do all of that, and I click update place, this looks quite good. And if I change something here, this should also be reflected. Let's see. Yeah, I got the exclamation marks at the end here too. So this is working. Let's also see this. Yeah, also looks good. So this is working, and with that we created our own hook to reuse our stateful form-related logic.